Okay, welcome everyone. My name's Stuart. I haven't made it to a lot of these evenings over the last few months, which is a sad thing, but the nature of my job and my life tends to pull me away. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming. The subject I have chosen is bees. The title, which I know takes as much thought for a lot of people as the actual content, is called Zen and the Art of Bee Maintenance. Okay? So yeah, hello and welcome. My talk is on the subject of bees. Firstly, I want to apologise if it's a bit scatty and random in places. That's partly down to my personality, but it's also because a week ago I was training with the Royal Navy. My talk on how I fuse a military and a more spiritual life will be given at a later date when I can give you an answer. So why am I here? Why are any of us here? No, it's not going to be one of those talks. The simple and straightforward reason I am here is because a while ago I got stung by a bee. Okay, just an ordinary bee, but this attack happened at a very special place at a very special time in my life. And just to show you a picture of the incident, that is it's blown up a bit, but I can pass that around. You can see for yourselves that I was stung. The incident occurred on my first ever solitary retreat. It was a few months after I completed a beekeeping course. The retreat at the time hadn't provided much insight, and I wasn't feeling particularly relaxed, to be honest. In fact, I had quite itchy feet. This is what led me to go out and search my surroundings. I was reading a book at the time, a book given to me by Sir Peter Cox there, and that book was named Meditation and the Art of Beekeeping. Did you see this thing, Pete? It's small, but it is there. I highlight that. It was a book that inspired me to think that you could indeed disclose information on a subject that most people might not know a lot about, but you could do it in a way that was engaging and insightful. So this was me. I found this apiary when I was walking around, and I took a picture of the book next to it, and I spent some time there. I want to pass that around. So, here I was on my retreat, beating myself up for breaking the most fundamental rule of upping and leaving for pastures green. But if I hadn't, I would never have come across the apiary, or never have decided to go take a closer look. Part of the beekeeping course was spending time in and around bees and becoming comfortable with them. Unfortunately for me, and more unfortunate for that bee, I got a little too comfortable. Most of us might know what happens to the bee once you get stung. Who can say what happens? The bee dies, yeah, unfortunately so. Yes, because of my excitement, ignorance, that bee would sadly be no more. I had a death in my conscience. It was the tail end of summer, there would be no more blooms, no more nectar till spring, which meant no more honey for 6 months. So what might have been relatively tame colony in the heights of summer became this rabid dog of the bee world. Eventually, the training kicked in, and the alarm bells rang of self-preservation, and I got the hell out of there. Because once a bee has stung, it releases a pheromone just to alert you, and all the other bees will literally come in and neutralise that threat. So in my retreat back to my sanctuary, in pain, not physical pain as such, although I can state that it does hurt quite considerably, but it was more the pain of knowing my actions had harmful consequences. This little sting had served as a kind of jolt to me, like this talk being that response to the jolt. I've not been to many of these young Buddhist evenings, and in fact now I live further away from the centre, I don't come as much as I would like. To give one of these talks, in all honesty, goes against my better judgment. If the Stuart of 3 years ago could see me doing what I'm doing right now, he would have to blink and rub his eyes to make sure he wasn't dreaming. So thanks, little bee. You gave your life for your little brothers and sisters, and in that have given me the opportunity to reach out and talk to my brothers and sisters. So how am I going to relate bees to the Dharma? That's a good question. In this room, I'm probably way down the pecking order of knowing who did what to whom and when during the Buddha's life and ever since. But what I am hoping is I know a little bit more than you guys about bees, okay? Otherwise, I'm going to look a little silly. So as I've just completed the Foundation Mitra Study course, a year that definitely saw me grow as a person. Yet I struggled with digesting the deeper, more obscure meanings to what I was hearing. Learning about all the jhanas and the realms, the Pali translations and the terms that they meant, used to see me disengage. I mean, if you asked me for the Latin word for a bee, I wouldn't have a clue. But it's comforting to know that some things are always constant. But what I have learned in the last year, and beginning to see at a more deeper level, is how things are interconnected. The intricate balance of human beings living in nature, and how sometimes we can do a lot better. So I've picked the topic of bees, or should I say they have picked me, because in my eyes there are no other species that have got their stuff together in such a prosperous, mutually beneficial way. Like a lot of things we read about in Buddhism, the bees' place in our world is in a way beyond our level of understanding and their importance. In my talk, I have not tried to select. I've tried to select some key moments in the life of a bee, considered in full circle from birth to death. It's a life that is hard and relatively short, just like I hope my talk will be. My aim is to highlight the difference between our two species and some of the similarities and what we can learn from a bee. I really want to leave it to you to dot the I's and cross the spiritual T's and take home food for thought. Hopefully that might be some golden amber nectar. No pee, that's not beer. The honeybee. The honeybee. This is the honeybee. This is a drawing I did myself, and I gave it as a present to Sadaraja at Windhorse. I'd like to pass that around. Okay, so let us begin our talk about bees. Our cute little insect friend, one who works so tirelessly and quietly around us, and is certainly one of the main reasons, if not the main reason, for the possibility of human development on the planet. Without them, the development of Earth, life on Earth, would be very different. The condition for human development may not have existed at all. What I'm referring to are the appearance of flower-bearing plants and pollinators, with the bees being the daddies of the pollinators. The bees, the flowers, human beings, and everything that have developed alongside us are all connected in a series of events over an enormous amount of time, even before the Buddha himself. The honeybee in Britain and many other countries all belong to the species known as Apis melli, see what I mean? Latin name, couldn't do it. Before we showed up and began raping the bee of its livelihood, they lived and thrived in forests around us, building their comb and making their homes in hollow trees. Something you can still see today, but more likely in old chimneys. 100 years ago, the British black bee held sway in this country, but due to various diseases, there is no longer the case. We have to look elsewhere to sustain our honey production. Like its people, this bee was said to be tough, hard-working, and thrifty. On the other side of the channel, the French had a similar-looking bee, and just like its people, it was prone to hard work, but was bad-tempered and aggressive. The Italian bee, which is different in colour, a little more light browner, but once again said to be like its people, prolific breeders, docile, and only works in hot climates. I could keep on. I have a long list of bees from every nation, but I'm not sure I'm going to offend. I'm looking at you, V, but I've got a great one on Dutch. Let's just say beekeepers in the UK have been forever searching for those winning characteristics and hope for a perfect bee. And that has resulted in bees being imported from all around the world. The net result of all this, majority of bees in Britain are a mixture of all the types mentioned, with a mixture of characteristics, some good, some bad. Bees within a time frame do become accustomed to its environment. Bees from the south are less likely to thrive in the north, and those acclimatised to the north. Being from Kent, and this far from London, is something I can relate to. A clear path, the roles of the honeybee. This is just some pictures from my beekeeping course. Zoomed in. There you go, if you'd like to have a look around. Okay, there are three types of honeybee. The three types of honeybee are the drone, the worker, and most importantly of all, the queen. All roughly have the same process of development, the only difference being the number of days spent as an egg to larva and the final stage of a pupa. Nurse bees, just one of the many potential roles a bee might have, will feed the young larvae honey and pollen mixed with hormones from their own glands. The honey provides the carbohydrates and the pollen provides the protein, and the larva needs to grow and metamorphosize into a bee. There is nothing better than seeing bees returning from a flight with all the different colours of textures and pollen on their hind legs. I could watch that all day. Amazing. The young remain as a larvae, after which the nurse bee covers the cells with a porous wax cap. The bees will eventually chew their way out of the egg to become a fully formed bee. That's when the real work begins. Moving on to the drone. As only females make honey, the drones, the males, or as I like to call them, the drone idols, are only to have one role, and that's to mate with the queen. And before all the males here get giddy and think, what a great life that would be, know this, most die before mating, since the queen only has to mate once in her life. But what a mating flight that is. I'll tell you that in due course. So if the opportunity does occur to mate, a 1 in 5 year phenomenon, the sad but true fact is the drone will die whilst mating, with its abdomen bursting through during the process. A triumph that I'm sure wouldn't put off many of the lads here. If you've got to go, sounds like you're going out without a bang. If it wasn't bad enough, since the drones are not needed, unless a queen is being reared, to save food, the drones are not allowed to live through winter. At some point in late autumn, the drones in the hive will be starved of food and driven out where they will perish. Bee life is all of a sudden sounding very attractive to all the women here, I'm sure. The worker. The worker bees that make up the vast majority of the bees in the hive are tasked in 2 separate stages. A bee begins with the task inside the hive, and with age, this transitions to working outside the hive. The new bee's first job is to serve in a cell, cleaning and capping. This is followed by a brood and queen tending. As the bee develops, it then takes on the work of building comb, housekeeping and transferring nectar and pollen as needed. The role we tend to see ourselves the most and get most gratification from is when the bees come foragers and make visits to our home gardens, flying distances as far as 3 miles from the hive in search of nectar and pollen. In the height of summer, there can be up to 5,000 bees in one hive. Last but not least, the queen. Each hive has only one queen. She is much longer than the workers. She is the only fertile female in the colony, and her main function is to lay eggs. But every female worker egg laid by the queen has the potential to become a queen. A queen begins as an ordinary female worker egg deposited by the previous queen in a special shaped queen cell, roughly the size and shape of a peanut shell. The quality and quantity of the food, known as royal jelly, is fed to the worker larvae by nurse bees and determines whether the female egg will be transformed into the queen. All developing larvae have the potential to mature into either workers or queens for the first 3 days of larva growth. By the 4th day, I'm reading this, it sounds so interesting to me, but I'm not sure if it's interesting to you, but it gets better, trust me. A hive only has a 6-day window to replace their queen, should she die unexpectedly. Without a queen, the hive is doomed because the workers will not be replaced as they die. If the new virgin queen is to head the colony, about a week after emerging from her cell, she will go out on her mating flight, where she will hook up with anywhere between 3 to 15 drones, the filthy minks. Upon safe arrival to the hive, she will probably start laying eggs within a few days. After this, she will rarely leave the hive and prefers to live in a dark place to hide away. At the height of her laying capabilities, she will lay between 175,000 to 200,000 eggs per year. She is the sole mother of hundreds of thousands of bees in her lifetime. Her other important role is to produce the pheromones that govern and organise many of the colony's functions. She can live up to 5 years, which is ancient in bee terms, but there's no loyalty amongst the workers, and she will be replaced as soon as the workers realise she's part of sell-by date. No one is safe. What I adore about the makeup of bees, the stages, the processes, the roles, is the clear path and how that makes things work. Nothing scares humans more than having their whole lives laid out in front of them with no room for adjustment. Yet it seems to be the bedrock of our own self-doubt and self-loathing. Today we have more choice than ever, whether be professionally or romantically, but it seems to be incapacitating. I used to live in Malawi, one of the poorest countries on the planet. Yet we know the stories. These people have nothing, yet they're always smiling and happy. I put this down to not being overwhelmed with choice. Beyond their basic survival needs of food, shelter and clothing, they don't want for much else. I think Banti said something that sums this up. More and more of less and less. If a bee is known to have a disease and therefore a mutation, it will literally trot off and sacrifice its own life knowing it's for the good of the colony. It is the overall collective conscience each and every bee has that I admire and feel we can learn from. A bee does not need to be told or nagged. There is no expectation. Every bee is working for the colony. They're like the Borg in Star Trek, but cool. The wiggle dance. This is the wiggle dance. When I initially wrote this talk, I was going to try and get people up to do the wiggle dance. but I think I'll just embarrass myself, and basically it's something like that. Okay? The wiggle dance. And this is how the bees communicate. Okay? But how do they do it? How do they work in such high numbers, in such close proximity, and not lose their cool? Are they originally from India? Foraging bees fly in search for flowers in bloom up to 3 miles. When they find a promising source, they sample it. They collect the nectar by sipping it. Then they carry the nectar back to the hive in their honey stomach. Upon arrival, the foragers deliver the nectar to the bees and then begin to communicate the source of the nectar to their sisters through a dance. The dance of the bee communicates both the distance and the direction of the nectar source. Carl von Frisch deciphered the nature of the dance. He wondered how the discovery of nectar by a few bees could suddenly result in several hundred showing up at the same time. He set up a glass observation hive and marked individual bees so to track their movements. A bee would return to the hive and after unloading her nectar would begin what von Frisch called a round dance. She would circle once to the right, then once to the left, repeating in circles with vigour. This would continue for 30 seconds or more in the same spot. The bee would then move on to another group of bees elsewhere in the hive and resume her little dance. The bees that observed would observe and grow in excitement, and at certain times would then fly off to their own nectar source and return to perform their own dance. Von Frisch's observations confirmed that bees' dance was a form of communication. Further studies enabled him to decipher their language. He learned that the round dance is performed to indicate the location of rich nectar sources near the hive, and the tail wagging dance, which I showed you, indicated the distance and direction of more distant sources. With this more complicated dance, he determined that the bee communicates distance by the number of turns it makes in a given time. He found the direction of the bee's run communicated turns it makes in a given time. He found that the direction of the bee's run communicated the direction to the nectar source, using the angle of the sun in the sky as a guide. He realized that changes in the dance corresponded with the height of the sun in the sky from morning to evening. If that wasn't enough, he also realized that the bees calculate the distance it has traveled by the amount of energy it consumes during that flight. The dancing bee basically tells the other bees, fly in this direction until you've used up this much fuel, then look for a flower that smells like this. Now bring back the nectar and tell the others. Now, I could attempt to say something that was funny or witty, but I'd like for us to just take a few seconds and reflect on what I just told you, like about this little insect that kind of say all these little words to each other. I think it's pretty cool. So, have a little thought. Okay, next is swarming, which I've renamed as spiritual rebirth. Has anyone seen a swarm happen? Yeah, it's pretty crazy stuff. So that, in case you haven't, is what a swarm looks like. I've never seen a swarm, but I've heard it can be quite a spectacle. Anywhere between 16 to 30,000 bees can be typical, taking up an area the size of a house. Most swarming occurs in mid-spring. This is so that a new set of bees will have time to find and construct a new home and fill it with honey before the onset of winter. As the size of the population increases, a swarm occurs literally because the bees outgrow the hive. The transmission of a swarm inhibiting pheromone released by the queen is reduced from bee to bee and acts as a catalyst for the worker bees to begin constructing 6 or more queen cells, from which a new potential queen can emerge. Once a swarm is in swing, with the old queen leaving, the newly emerged queens fight to the death. There can be only one. When I became seriously interested in Buddhism, I felt like I was outgrowing my environment, in particular with some of my friends and family. I had new ideas, ones that I felt were inspiring and progressive, but for some reason these ideas fell flat on many of my friends and family. Lucky for them, Buddhism is a peaceful and loving philosophy, and I didn't have to kill any of them to be the last man standing. However, I did up and leave and came here to Cambridge, and now I work at Windhorse. Swarming is a perfectly normal phenomenon. Living creatures must multiply to survive. In evolution, creatures that do not multiply eventually will decline and become extinct. One colony is vulnerable to disease, starvation, fire or attack, and may be destroyed at any time. To overcome this risk, colonies have developed the ability to split, so there is more than one colony where one only existed before. The original colony might not survive, but there are now increased chances of success. Of course, you can never use the term swarming to refer to what the Buddha did, or what the tree arachne movement is accomplishing so well at present, but it is somewhat like. There is strength in numbers. But those numbers need to be spread out and take on their own identity. And that's what I love about this movement. We have centres in countries around the globe, and the numbers of order members is on the increase all the time. We as a movement could survive a surprise attack from the NKT and come back even stronger. Community, the Sangha. Okay, this is a beehive. After my beekeeping course, I bought a hive in my excitement. I had bees in my excitement, which was fantastic, but I had nowhere to put my bees. So I unfortunately didn't become a beekeeper this year. So what I did, I made a bee table. And I used my hive, put a glass, and I made a coffee table out of it. And yeah. So, but one day. Okay. So community, the Sangha. So bees are so frantic, zipping around, one going in, the other coming out. When do they get the chance to chill out and be with one another? Not just as a colony, but as a community. Well, with the first frost of winter, the bees form a cluster in the centre of the hive. The bees pack tightly together into a rugby ball-shaped mass. Somewhere in the middle will be the queen. The bees consume food and give off heat in the process to maintain the required temperature in the centre of the cluster. The bees on the outside become colder than those on the inside, and over a period of time, they rotate. The colder weather, the more food is needed to maintain the temperature. The coming together of the bees is the only way that they can survive the harsh realities of winter. We Buddhists like to come together, no matter the season, for tea and long walks, giving off the warmth of stimulating conversations and advice. Death. Okay, I'm going to hold back this picture just for a second. Much has been said about the alarming rate in which bees have been declining over the last 20 years. With colonies collapsing overnight, stories that would make a Hollywood film seem far-fetched. It makes worldly news regularly, and if any one of you has a keen interest in bees, especially in recent weeks, suffices to say, it's our fault that the bees are dying. But when I speak of death, I don't want us to consider globally. Instead, I want us to think more locally. The individual bee at the bottom of your garden. Think about this expression, busy as a bee. But are the bees, in fact, busy? Well, come to think that we have. Each drop of honey we have in the little pots at home represents about 40 drops that the bees have had to evaporate nearly all of the moisture for it to become the golden syrup we put on our toast and in our tea. A strong working hive will contain close to 90 kilograms of honey. What does this equate to? One calculation has it that 450 grams of honey represents visits to over 2 million flowers. A worker bee will live approximately for about 6 weeks in summer, perhaps 20 weeks over the winter, when it literally seems to wear itself out. It will be flying along, then all of a sudden, bang, it will drop down dead. You can see the difference between newly hatched bees with their shining golden fur and sparkling wings, and the worn-out balding veterans with their wings all tattered and torn. It's this point where we have to think to ourselves, finally, is this where the humans excel and the bees get it all wrong? We would never get sucked into working long hours whereby we neglect our families and ourselves. What does our reality tell us? Is this happening all the time? Is it happening right now? And to our friends, family, our work colleagues who always seem flustered and never have enough time to get all the things they need to do? Many of us, like the bee, are ultimately working themselves into an early grave, but unlike the bee, with little or no reward. I took this extract from a book I was reading during my solitary. The average Japanese person works 2,044 hours a year. That's 400 more hours than a German. A condition known as karoshi results from being overworked, tired and stressed, whereby a person will keel over and die from a burst blood vessel in the brain due to exhaustion. Many Japanese companies are said to be to blame, and it's easy to see why. Do you know those handy little plastic fish that contain our soy sauce dispensers that we get with our sushi? They were invented so Japanese workers didn't have the excuse to swan off at lunchtime for a break to stock up on their soy sauce. Apparently, soy sauce is the equivalent to our ketchup, so no meal is complete without it. So in my conclusion, most of nature lives in this kill or be killed life cycle. There is nothing wrong with it, it's just the way it is. It's sometimes called the grand plan. Bees follow another plan, one which is in contrast to what I just said. Their relationship with the world is one of benefit, of mutual benefit. The bees make more flowers by cross-pollination, which in turn makes more food produced from those plants. The bees are in full-blown embrace with nature, which I think as Buddhists we can recognise and try to embrace. My talk wasn't designed to try and make you want to become a beekeeper. This is where I show you. That's me in my beekeeping suit that I got for Christmas. But the same, my talk wasn't designed to try and make you want to become a beekeeper. The same lack of intention I have when I speak to people about Buddhism. My intention was to marvel in the creation of the bee. Beekeeping in its current form, meaning using hives, has only come about since the early 1800s, when a certain Reverend Lorenzo Langstroth came up with a way of building a reusable structure. Harvesting the honey before his patent involved a serious amount of disruption and destruction to the hive, resulting in most of the bees being killed, which distressed Langstroth greatly. His hive used a combination of chambers and frames, utilising what he had learned about bee behaviour. The fact that a certain amount of space in between frames would allow enough movement for the bees to work their magic, but not to be too big that they would fill it with propolis as a security measure. All of us here share a common trait with Langstroth. If we see a problem, we try and fix it. Before we decided to live a more spiritual life, we may have sought a more content, happy life. Yet at the same time, we were probably acting in ways that would make this impossible. It is not until we use Buddhism as a framework for a more positive approach to our lives that this really stood a chance of happening. So like Langstroth and the Buddha, we are all practical investigators, ducking and weaving, observing life's events and our actions, all the while trying to make sense of it all. Again, like these two greats mentioned, observation is not enough. We have to act, implement, and most importantly of all, keep motivated, because this process of trial and error will have its ups and downs. In our pursuit for the truth, we have to know it comes in many forms. I purposely did not just mention the WBC hive, the National Hive, the Smith Hive, the Modified Commercial Hive, and the Modified Dadant Hive. Not because I don't think you can handle this overkill of information. They are all great hives, housing the bees in different but ultimately similar ways. My last thought is only through inquiry and analysis, played out in experience, will we get closer to that peace and tranquility we yearn for. There are just as many types of bees as there are types of personalities. There is no one hive, there is no one path. Thank you.